Tell me about the neighborhood you grew up in and what it was like growing up.
Okay, I recall, now we're talking about the late 40s, I guess. I was residing at the corner of Hess and King Street in the city of Hamilton, a pretty tough area. I went to Hess Street School. At that time, a cat with a tail was a novelty. And but being Jewish was always difficult because there was always little pockets that didn't appreciate Jewish boys. So we had to sort of circulate around several blocks to get to Hess Street School. And there was a whole group of Jewish merchants on York Street there, and that had stores, grocery stores, etc. And we were always down there taking advantage of those stores. And that was my area growing up. Oh, and we had to go down to the Jewish Community Center on Delaware Street. So that was a couple of bus passes. And at that time, you took the bus. You didn't get carpooled down there. So that was always interesting. And that's where my life centered around, actually, was the Jewish Community Center on Delaware Street. That's where we went to Cheder there. Actually, I started out going to Shula. A guy named David Kunigas ran the Shula program, who was a commie, and ultimately got raided. Well, my mom wanted me to speak to my grandfather in Yiddish, so that was very important to her. So before I ever went to Cheder, I went to Shula. Interesting group of people that were there. And we played sports there, a lot of basketball, and that's where I made all my connections. And that's where our Jewish dances took place, and that's where our socializing took place, all together at Jewish Community Center. And education wasn't separated at the time, so you went to Cheder or Shula, and you then went and played basketball there, and you had all your dances. That's growing up.
Take it over.
It was an exciting place, wasn't it?
Well, it was vibrant.
I just want to put it into some context. When I came to Hamilton in the early 70s, the heyday of the JCC had passed.
Mm-hmm.
But it seemed to me, from talking to people, that it was really a kind of glue that held a lot of people together, and people really did spend an enormous amount of time down there. Is that the way it was?
Oh, absolutely. I think that all our evenings or days were spent at the Jewish Community Center. I was there a considerable period of time as I was growing up in my teenage years. And as I pointed out, because the schooling was there, you were there. So you just automatically filtered into the sports program or the social program or whatever was taking place. And it was a vibrant place because at that point a lot of the athletes would come down and get massages. A guy named Pinky Lewis was there that would massage the athletes, and the wrestlers, a couple of Jewish wrestlers, Martin Hatzler, I guess, and being one of them, and Jack Laskin would be down there. So, and the football players would come down because Pinky Lewis was a trainer for a lot of for the Hamilton Tiger Cats. So they would be there on a Sunday. It was a great spot. It really was a great spot. I have no regrets growing up in Hamilton and having the Jewish Community Center there. And it was unfortunate when education all went their separate ways, when the rabbis determined that they wanted to have separate educational facilities. And that was the beginning of the end for the Jewish Community Center, because at that point now you didn't have a feeder any longer. So you were dependent upon kids going back to the Jewish Community Center, and it just didn't happen.
Do you remember when this decision was made to, I mean, I don't know how old you are or anything, so I don't know if you remember, but when the rabbis decided to take control of education, do you remember that? Was that a big to-do in the community?
I don't know. I obviously, when they made the decision, I wasn't around as part of one of the decision makers. I was still a kid. So I have to assume that it took place maybe in the 60s at some point. For whatever reasons, they had their own reason. And I think at the time also, the community may have been looking around for another place to have a center. One of the places that was looked at was the old Hillfield grounds, which is on Main Street there. That is now the Columbia School they were looking at that site, and had they been able to put together a group to have gone on that site, it would certainly have helped the Jewish community. I think everything could have been programmed out of that particular place. Once again, it's just regrettable that education got dispersed, and as a result, we lost our community.
You grew up in which synagogue?
Initially Beth Jacob, and my family, some of my family went to Addis Israel, and ultimately when my kids went to parochial school, they wanted to go to the Addis Israel, and that's how we sort of filtered back to the Addis Israel. But when I grew up, Beth Jacob. Oh, and Beth Jacob, you know, when you think about it, Beth Jacob had 50% of the population in Hamilton went to Beth Jacob, that conservative movement. And the other 50% were divided probably equally between Addis and the Temple at the time.
Because I know, I've certainly heard that in the 50s, in the early 60s, I mean, the Beth Jacob was the shul in the city. I mean, that's where people went.
Oh, yeah. USY, great dances. We had such a great time. Going out to various communities, specifically Buffalo, and intermingling with them. And that was fun. And there was fraternities also. I mean, there were 2 fraternities in town. I was a member of Alpha Phi Pi, and we had just some very great social events that took place. And when you're growing up and you're part of a Jewish fraternity, it made life a little nicer. And you always had some place to go, some reason to be hanging out with a group.
I've never heard of any Jewish fraternities in Hamilton, and now you're saying that there were 2.
There were 2.
So where was the one that you were part of?
Well, the high school, it was a high school fraternity. I went to Westdale Secondary School. There were a lot of Jewish kids that were at Delta. And I think Central was around at the time too. So out of that group, this fraternity got started, and I was asked to pledge it along with others, and I did. The initiation was always fun. You were dressed up in some ridiculous costume down at the middle of Hamilton at James and King, either fishing in a sewer or having to go buy something that was inappropriate at the Leggett's or whatever was down there, Rexall stores, or having to be in Gore Park doing something ridiculous. But it was fun, and that was the initiation, and then you were in, and pledging was always arduous. And then you can just turn the tables on the next group that were coming in.
What was the difference between the 2? Was there a difference between the 2? Like, was one the in one? Was one?
Well, I'd like to think Alpha Phi Pi was definitely the in one. I'm not too sure that was the case. That probably was the case. There was a group. Maybe there was a little bit of elitism that took place during that period of time. But generally speaking, not really.
What's the other one called? Do you know what the other one was called?
I should know it. I'm having...
Wasn't it AZA?
Yeah, AZA. Thank you. AZA, that's what it is.
Stand for?
I have no idea. But I think it was connected with B'nai B'rith at the time. Pardon?
It was the more Jewish one, probably.
I wouldn't say that. We didn't have any non-Jews at Alpha Phi Pi.
What kind of activities would you organize?
Probably all social. That was the main function. I had a couple of charity events where we went out and raised some money for some project or other, or helped in whatever projects that were going on. But mostly it was social. And it was, I think you got involved, say, grade 10 or 11, and it was for a few years. And you wore the Alpha Phi Pi jacket with the big crest on it.
Was there a sorority?
Was there a sorority? It could have been AZA also, I'm not too sure. I don't recall. You have to ask someone like Liz Tick, okay, who may have some input about the sorority. I can't remember.
When you're growing up, you mentioned that going to Hess, the fact that you were Jewish meant that you had to sometimes take a couple of extra turns and so on. when you grow up in Hamilton, do you remember whether anti-Semitism was an issue? An issue for you, for people like yourself?
Frankly, it wasn't a major issue. Not that I can recall. There might be pockets of anti-Semitic behavior, but generally speaking, not particularly. I probably experienced more so than my kids experienced. My kids, I don't think, ever experienced anti-Semitic problems. Mind you, they went to Hamilton Hebrew Academy, so they were pretty insulated at the time. But even when they went to Westdale, I don't think they felt that there was any great anti-Semitic situations there. Growing up, there was the occasional one, but frankly, I can't say that it was prevalent. They had a lot of freedom.
Sure. Here's something that I don't think we've talked to anyone about, so your take on this is going to be the very first that
Okay.
we're going to get. I know that your kids went to the academy. I don't know how many kids you have.
Two.
My guess is that they don't. Do they live in Hamilton?
No.
They don't. So I'm asking you to sort of fast forward 15 years down the road. Do you see that this community is going to be able to sustain itself? Do you see that in 15 years from now, when someone comes into this community, it will have been depleted considerably? I mean, I have children. None of them is in Hamilton. I don't foresee that any of them will return to Hamilton, except for occasional visits. So, just think out loud about what this community might look like in 15 years. Wendy and I have spoken about it informally, if I remember Wendy, but it's an interesting thing to think about when one looks into the future.
It's a very important question that you ask, and I think this community has to be concerned as to what the future will be with regard to Jews coming in, the Jewish population here. We thought, this is going back to 1980 now, that the influx of Russians that came in, because this community was very generous at the time when Russian immigration was taking place, and Rabbi Green was in the forefront of making sure that there was living accommodations, making sure that their kids were educated and maybe some jobs were available. Almost to a person, they all left this city to go to Toronto or elsewhere. Russian immigration was very important, would have made a big difference to this community had the Russian immigrants stayed. The only Russian immigrant I can recall that actually did stay was the Bachmans. There might have been others, but that is one family that I know that did stay. So we're not getting immigration coming into Hamilton, which I think is very important. It's probably important for Canada also. That's why we have a very liberal immigration policy in this country to keep us going, because we are not able to produce enough. My friends' children all have left, generally speaking, Hamilton, as mine have. So that's a concern. And now when you analyze what's happening with the various, let's look at the synagogues. I mean, Beth Jacob has fallen onto hard times. That was our most populous synagogue. That's fallen onto hard times. They're struggling. And it may be that there is just not enough regeneration. Addis Israel attempted to start a yeshiva here, and they probably have their own community that is self-sustaining. But as long as kids decide they don't want to remain in this community, either there's not enough jobs, or not enough issue, or not enough areas that they're interested in. I mean, even Rabbi Green's children have left. That tells you something. So that is definitely a concern as to what's going to happen in the future. If you look around Niagara Falls, Port Colborne, St. Catharines, all in the Golden Horseshoe, you can see that those Jewish communities have almost vanished. And some of them were very vibrant communities in and around this Golden Horseshoe. So, yeah, there's fears, and the big city sucks up. That sucking sound you hear are all our kids going down the road to Toronto and elsewhere.
Well, you know, when I've spoken to Wendy, I think that what we discovered was that those that stay behind are ones whose parents own some business, and so they simply go into the business, whether it has to do with, I don't know everyone, but take for instance the Strub brothers.
Yes.
That makes some sense. There are probably other examples as well. But other than those kinds of people, I don't know of many young people that choose to stay in Hamilton.
Well, you'd know better than I. I don't know what happens with the medical facility as to whether those who have come into Hamilton as a result of McMaster University have made a contribution to our community or not. I'm uncertain. I thought that would be one of the big drawing cards. Other than that, we don't have a big drawing card. You're right. The retailers that were here, many have closed shop. So it's a concern.
You must have known most. I mean, not that you must have known. I was thinking about this afternoon that when I came to Hamilton from Montreal, what was quite remarkable to both of us, to me and to Rivka, was the fact that Jewish life was centered around the synagogues. In other words, there was a Jewish community center on Delaware, but by the time we got here, it was hardly ever used. So everything seemed to center around the synagogues. In Montreal, the synagogues, when we were growing up, really didn't play much of a role in our lives. Our lives were centered around the Zionist movement, so we both belonged to Zionist youth groups, and here we come into Hamilton, and you know, if you don't hook yourself up to a shul, it was going to be challenging to make friends. When you grew up here, did you know most of the people in the community? It's a relatively small community compared to Montreal. I mean, it had to have 4,000 people perhaps when you were growing up. Did people mostly know one another? If you belonged to the Beth Jacob, did you also hang out with younger people who belonged to the Addis or to the temple? Or did the synagogues really constitute separate communities, so to speak?
When I was growing up, there was definitely a merger. It didn't, in our minds, the fact that somebody was going either the temple or the Addis or the Beth Jacob was insignificant. It was what age group you were in, and that is where your friendships lay. And as I pointed out, the Jewish Community Center was that focal point. That was a melting pot. That's where everyone met. And we all hung out together. I mean, even if you were a member of fraternity, it didn't make any difference what your religious convictions were or where your parents were going. Had nothing to do with that. It just happened to you deal with the age of the group. It's unfortunate that that was discontinued, and I quite agree with you. When the synagogues became powerful and determined who was going to go where in terms of education, as I point out, that was definitely a breakup and a breakdown of that community spirit. Now, I probably knew most of the families that lived in Hamilton. I mean, either as a kid or your parents were involved with the Grand Order of Israel, or B'nai B'rith, or whatever organization, and you'd go to their picnics or what have you. I think generally speaking, you knew everybody in the community. And it really didn't play a role as to where you went religiously. We didn't have that great schism of the religious right versus the left. There was none of that. That wasn't prevalent. That didn't occur to recent times, frankly, unfortunately. Sad. Now.
It's, I mean, I don't don't know if it's if everyone thinks that it's sad. It's
Well, I'm sure they don't.
it's a very politicized community in some respects, and there are, individuals who have made it their business to bring their political views into how they organize and see how to organize the community. But that's perhaps beyond the scope of what this project of ours is all about. Do you remember any characters? I mean, if somebody says, were there any real eccentric...
Aside from Wendy's dad, you mean?
Wendy's dad probably qualifies, but in addition to...
Oh, I'm sure there were some great characters that...
Were there any people... Let me just rephrase it, because the question wasn't such a good question. When you reflect on whether there were any people who you think made a difference, really made a difference to Jewish life or to the organization of Jewish life in this city, are there any people whose names stand out?
Well, there's no question the rabbis made a big difference, either positive or negative. So they were a driving force. Rabbi Baskin was a very strong spiritual leader. At the Bet Jacob, there was prior to Rabbi Silverman, there was a Rabbi Simon. They were very strong leaders, and of course Rabbi Green came on the scene and had the energy and the determination and the vision to have a Hamilton Hebrew Academy established, which certainly has grown and was very instrumental in our Jewish community. Within the general community, within Federation, when I was involved with Federation, there were people who made considerable contributions. The presidents of the Federation were men and women. There was Millie State and her husband, Albert State, very active at the time, made contributions. The late Bernie Greenbaum was the one who actually established a pension plan for the people who were involved in Federation and Jewish Community Center, so they could, in fact, be taken care of after their tenure, which is very important. Of course, Francis Sobel and the late Ken Sobel were very important in our community in terms of financial aid and generally being a liaison between the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community. Home for the Aged was a very important issue, and one of the persons who were in the forefront was the late Ludwig Benario. And I think it's important that you go back and understand what Ludwig did for this city. An incredibly energized man who contributed a tremendous amount. It was only through his inspiration and his driving force that we have a Home for the Aged today. And I would say he made a huge contribution. There was an estate at one time that was going to give money, and we had to go to court to try to wrestle the money out from that estate. That was very interesting. In the legal community, if you ask me, there were the Schreiber brothers. They were really men that you can't forget, unforgettable people.
Didn't the community also produce some judges?
Yes, they did.
Do you know any?
Personally?
Do you know any?
That we had... we were fortunate to have some Jewish judges in this community.
Aren't you one of them?
I happen to be one of them. But really, there was Justice Sweet, Jed Sweet,
right.
Crusty guy, and of course David Steinberg, who has been in the forefront of family law, written the books, really was a father of the Unified Family Court, has made a tremendous contribution, not merely to the Jewish community, but also to the non-Jewish and to our legal evolution. So he is to be applauded. And here's one guy that's got the energy. I mean, he will go back and help out in the community. He went back to the synagogue now and is trying to get that revitalized. I've got a lot of respect, and he happens to be a very close friend. And George Zutrin, I better mention George Zutrin, another fine man who's also a judge in this city and does a great job in the family.
Seems to think that he knows something about wine.
Who does he?
Well, I don't know.
Well, wine in the sense of why can't I go to Florida more often, that type of wine? No, I didn't mean that, George.
I know. But, I'm through, and you're wonderful. I just want to ask you one other question. Who is the best tennis player amongst the people with whom I see you playing all the time?
Okay, heads and shoulders above everyone else, and it is not me. Michael Sherman.
I didn't ask you who is the loudest.
No, he also was
Who is the
that.
best?
Billy, he's not only the loudest, but he's also the best.
Michael Sherman, if I remember correctly, once told me that he has a collection of baseball cards of Cleveland Indians. Am I right or wrong?
Boy, mine were all thrown out. I haven't seen it. It's possible. Oh, Mike's an interesting guy.
I think it's Sherman who told
Yeah.
me that he specialized
He should be interviewed.
Cleveland Indians.
He's got a whole perspective.
I'm sure. Listen, I thank you.
I'm not done.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we don't care. Go
Um,
ahead. Go fast.
This whole,
No, I'm just
your
kidding.
opening statement about growing up in your neighborhood, just tell me what street did you live on and paint me a picture of the street that you lived in, the neighborhood you grew up in, and Hess Street School and that whole era. And what year was it?
I have to tell you the year, Wendy? Well, as I said, it was in the late 40s. And it was a lower middle class area at the time. There were pockets of Jewish homes in and around the area. This was just prior to moving west. And I went to Hess Street School, and I also went to Ryerson, which was just up the way. And when I was approximately 12 or 13, my parents went out to Westdale because that's where all the Jews were moving at the time. So most of the Jews moved out of the East End or the middle of Hamilton to Westdale.
What street did you grow up on?
Klein Avenue South was my parental home when I was growing up, which was north of Main Street, not south where the Addis is. And Dalewood School, I went to Dalewood School in grade 8, which was just a block away, and I went to Westdale High School. But when we went to Westdale, boy, that was a huge move in my life. I mean, man, that was a step up, a huge step up from Hess and King Street. Whoa! I mean, I made the big time. Different social, economic area, middle class to high middle class, to upper class. So it was quite a move at the time. And
In what way? You mean just the neighborhood, the houses were nicer?
the houses were nicer, different group of people that you were associating with. Yeah.
So were those the golden years?
Yes, definitely.